Movie ratings are supposed to guide parents, but sometimes the system completely failed. How else can you explain movies filled with scares, intense moments, and nightmare fuel slipping through with a soft PG label on the poster? These weren't harmless family outings. They were emotional roller coasters that left kids covering their eyes. Which of these so-called PG films scarred the most viewers for life? Stick around, because the choices ahead will have you asking one thing. How did this ever pass as PG? Jaws 1975. This wasn't just a thriller about a shark. It was a cultural earthquake. Steven Spielberg's Jaws may have been sold as summer entertainment, but what audiences got was a film that redefined fear itself. The opening scene set the tone. A young woman dragged underwater by an unseen monster, her screams echoing as the ocean swallowed her whole. That alone was more chilling than anything PG families expected. The terror only escalated. Severed limbs drifted across the screen, mangled bodies surfaced, and close-ups of attacks left viewers stunned. Parents quickly realized this wasn't a lighthearted beach adventure. At the time, the PG-13 rating didn't exist, so the MPAA forced movies into a simple PG or R box. An R would have gutted the box office, so the studio fought for PG, even with sequences that still shock today. The fallout was massive. Kids begged never to go swimming again. Adults suddenly feared the water in ways they never had before. Shark populations even dropped in real life as fear turned into paranoia. Jaws didn't just mislead families, it scarred an entire generation. Looking back, the PG rating feels laughable. This was a film that thrived on intensity, and if it premiered today, there's no chance it would land anything less than PG-13. The only question is, how many kids had their childhoods hijacked by that little PG stamp? Poltergeist 1982. What fans never realized was that a family ghost story could turn into full-blown nightmare fuel. Poltergeist was produced by Steven Spielberg and directed by Tobe Hooper, and somehow it ended up with a PG rating. That single decision terrified families across the world. Parents who rented it thinking it was spooky fun found themselves glued to a relentless barrage of terrifying imagery. The story centers on a suburban family haunted by spirits that literally kidnap their young daughter through the television. That's unsettling enough, but the visuals pushed it further. Chairs stacked mysteriously, ghostly arms reached out of the TV, and corpses surfaced from a muddy backyard pool. One infamous moment showed a character peeling his own face in the mirror. These were not kid-friendly chills. They were straight horror. Originally, the MPAA slapped Poltergeist with an R rating. MGM appealed, fearing that an R would kill the film's financial chances. Against all logic, the board backed down. The PG stamp let Poltergeist invade homes and traumatize kids who thought they were just in for a harmless scare. The result? An instant hit that became a childhood trauma factory. To this day, Poltergeist remains one of the clearest examples of how the MPAA caved to studio pressure, ignoring common sense. What's scarier than the ghosts? The fact that the system said it was safe for children. Clash of the Titans, 1981. This wasn't just a mythological adventure. It was a monster showcase, filled with moments far more intense than its PG rating suggested. Families expecting a harmless fantasy were instead treated to graphic battles, terrifying creatures, and imagery that still startles today. Ray Harryhausen's stop-motion effects were groundbreaking but also deeply unsettling. The Medusa sequence alone was nightmare fuel. Her slithering body, glowing eyes, and the sound of arrows whizzing through her lair kept kids frozen in their seats. The Kraken's destructive rampage didn't feel like fantasy. It felt apocalyptic. Add in winged demons, beheadings, and corpses, and you had a movie that pushed PG to its absolute limits. The tone swung between mythic spectacle and full-blown horror. For adults, it was thrilling. For children, it was a shock to the system. Parents walked out, realizing that the MPAA's rating had failed them again. Clash of the Titans has since become a cult favorite, admired for its ambition and effects, but its PG rating remains baffling. This wasn't light fantasy. It was nightmare mythology that scarred young minds and proved once again that the MPAA couldn't always be trusted. Gremlins, 1984. This wasn't just a Christmas comedy. It was a horror film disguised in fuzzy wrapping paper. Gremlins lured families in with the promise of a cute creature named Gizmo and a PG rating that suggested festive fun. Instead, it unleashed one of the darkest family movies of the 80s. What began with a cuddly mogwai quickly devolved into a plague of scaly monsters wreaking havoc. Director Joe Dante leaned into slapstick, but the violence was impossible to ignore. Gremlins exploded in microwaves, were chopped into goo in blenders, and staged chaotic attacks across a small town. One infamous kitchen scene remains burned into memory. Blood, claws, and total destruction, all labeled PG. Parents felt tricked. Just like Temple of Doom, the backlash was enormous, with complaints flooding in about how something so violent could be deemed safe for children. Alongside Indiana Jones, Gremlins became the final straw that forced the MPAA to invent the PG-13 rating. The irony? The controversy only boosted its cult status. Kids who sneaked a look grew up either scarred or obsessed, while adults debated whether it was comedy or nightmare fuel. Gremlins is now a holiday classic, but it also stands as proof of the MPAA's massive misstep. PG didn't mean pretty good fun. In this case, it meant prepare for gore and chaos. Labyrinth 1986. This wasn't just a fantasy adventure with puppets. It was a surreal fever dream that left kids shaken despite its PG rating. Families walked in expecting a whimsical fairy tale starring David Bowie and Jim Henson's creations. What they got was a strange, unsettling mix of bizarre visuals, dark undertones, and characters that veered straight into nightmare territory. On paper, Labyrinth sounds harmless. A teenage girl must rescue her baby brother from the Goblin King by navigating a magical maze. But the execution was anything but child-friendly. Puppets weren't always cute. They were grotesquely exaggerated, or outright frightening. The Fireys, creatures who gleefully popped their own heads off, terrified countless kids. The Bog of Stench oozed with grotesque detail, and the baby-snatching plotline alone was enough to spark anxiety. Then there was Bowie's Goblin King, a character equal parts magnetic and menacing. His presence loomed over the entire film, making the story feel much darker than the PG rating suggested. Add in surreal set pieces, an eerie soundtrack, and visuals that pushed into uncanny territory, and you had a movie that unsettled far more than it comforted. The MPAA waved it through with a PG, ignoring the fact that this wasn't a simple puppet adventure. For many young viewers, Labyrinth was less magical escape and more psychological gauntlet. While it has since become a beloved cult classic, admired for its creativity and music, it's also remembered as one of the strangest films ever stamped as family safe. PG suggested light fantasy. What audiences actually got was a dreamlike descent into weirdness that haunted them long after the credits rolled. Watership Down, 1978. This wasn't just an animated story about rabbits. It was a survival epic drenched in blood and fear. Parents saw a cartoon with talking animals and assumed it was kid-friendly. Instead, Watership Down delivered brutal fights, predators tearing into rabbits, and scenes so raw that children were left in tears. Adapted from Richard Adams' novel, the movie was always meant to be heavy. It explored leadership, survival, and the cruelty of nature. But the animation style misled countless families. What unfolded on screen was violent, relentless, and emotionally scarring. Bunnies clawed at each other's throats, predators ripped them apart, and blood stained the fields. This wasn't stylized fantasy, it was harsh realism that played more like a war film than a bedtime story. The MPAA, for reasons still baffling today, slapped it with a PG rating. No warning, no indication of the trauma awaiting kids who tuned in expecting Disney-level sweetness. Decades later, adults still recall this movie as one of the most disturbing viewing experiences of their childhood. Watership Down has since earned respect as a dark allegory with artistic merit, but that doesn't erase the impact of its misrating. It remains one of the clearest examples of how animation can deceive, and how the MPAA failed to recognize intensity when it was right in front of them. Those poor rabbits deserved better than a soft PG, and so did the children who weren't ready for what they saw, who framed Roger Rabbit, 1988. This wasn't just a cartoon comedy, it was a collision of slapstick and nightmare fuel. Who Framed Roger Rabbit blended live action with animation in groundbreaking ways, but the PG rating hid how dark it really was. Parents thought they were bringing kids to a cartoon-filled mystery. What they got was acid baths, mobsters, and one of the scariest villains ever put on screen. The movie's biggest shock came from Judge Doom, played with terrifying intensity by Christopher Lloyd. His bug-eyed reveal left kids covering their faces. Add in the infamous dip, a substance used to dissolve cartoon characters in grotesque fashion, and you've got imagery that stuck in minds for decades. But the darkness didn't stop there. The movie was full of sharp innuendos and sly humor clearly meant for adults. Toons were gunned down in alleys, bar fights broke out with cartoon chaos, and tension ran throughout. Yet the MPAA still labeled it PG, as if it was just another animated romp. The result was a film that both captivated and scarred a generation. Roger Rabbit became a massive hit, praised for innovation, but its rating remains one of the most baffling calls in MPAA history. If there was ever a movie that screamed PG-13 before the system had matured, this was it. Instead, families were blindsided by a cartoon comedy that wasn't safe for children at all. NeverEnding Story, 1984. This wasn't just a fantasy adventure. It was one of the most haunting PG-rated films ever unleashed on unsuspecting families. On the surface, the NeverEnding Story looked like a harmless tale about a boy swept into a magical book. But what kids got instead was grief, despair, and scenes so intense they're still talked about decades later. The film dove straight into heavy emotions. One of the most infamous moments, Atreyu losing his horse Artax in the swamps of sadness, was devastating. Watching a beloved animal slowly sink while the boy cried out in agony left children bawling in theaters. It was less an adventure and more a gut punch of despair. And that was only the beginning. The monstrous wolf, Gamork, lurking in the shadows, looked like something pulled out of a horror film. The Nothing, a swirling force of destruction, wasn't just a villain. It was the embodiment of hopelessness. Combined with eerie landscapes and moments of genuine terror, the movie had a weight that no PG label could ever warn about. Parents expecting whimsy were left consoling kids who had just been exposed to overwhelming themes of death, loss, and existential dread. Critics praised the ambition, but audiences agreed. This was far too heavy for a family fantasy. The NeverEnding Story has since become a cult classic, remembered for its creativity and emotional power. But its misrating is legendary. PG suggested harmless fun, yet what families got was a devastating story that scarred a generation. It's proof that sometimes the MPAA didn't just miss the mark, they ignored it completely. Spaceballs, 1987. This wasn't just a sci-fi parody, it was a comedy that gleefully pushed boundaries far beyond what PG usually allowed. Mel Brooks' Spaceballs is beloved today for its endless gags and quotable lines. But at the time, parents were floored by what the MPAA let slip through. The humor wasn't just silly, it was crude, sharp, and often outrageous. Lines that no kid should have been repeating made their way into playground chatter thanks to that PG label. The movie was peppered with suggestive jokes, cheeky innuendos, and edgy slapstick that clearly aimed higher than family-friendly comedy. And yet, the MPAA shrugged and handed it a PG. Maybe it was because the movie was a parody of Star Wars, or maybe they underestimated how far Brooks was willing to go. Either way, families expecting a harmless spoof were blindsided by dialogue and gags that leaned heavily into territory closer to PG-13. In hindsight, Spaceballs thrived because of its daring humor. It became a cult classic precisely because it didn't play it safe. But its rating remains laughable. This was not a film meant for young kids, and the PG stamp only confused parents further. Today, no one would blink at it being PG-13. Back then, parents had no choice but to laugh or cringe while their kids repeated lines they absolutely shouldn't have heard. The Dark Crystal, 1982. This wasn't just a puppet fantasy, it was a full-on descent into nightmare territory. Jim Henson, best known for The Muppets, surprised the world with The Dark Crystal, a film that looked like a magical adventure but played more like horror. Somehow, it walked away with a PG rating. The creatures alone were enough to unsettle. The Skeksis, bird-like rulers with rotting bodies, drained the life essence from captives in scenes that felt disturbingly cruel. Add in torture chambers, eerie rituals, and the constant presence of death, and you had a movie that unsettled even adults. Children were horrified, some walking out of theaters in tears. The tone was relentless. The landscapes were bleak, the battles intense, and the atmosphere oppressive. There was little levity, only a dark and foreboding sense of doom. Critics admired its artistry, but families expecting Muppet-style magic were instead handed a heavy, terrifying fantasy that scarred young minds. The MPAA's PG rating did nothing to prepare anyone. It let parents walk into theaters blind, thinking this was harmless fantasy. What they got was one of the most psychologically intense films of the decade. The Dark Crystal has since earned cult status among fantasy fans, but it remains a textbook case of how the MPAA completely misread the room. Puppet movie or not, this wasn't for kids. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, 1971. This wasn't just a candy-coated musical. It was one of the strangest, most unsettling PG-rated films ever released. Parents brought their kids expecting a harmless fantasy about golden tickets and chocolate rivers. Instead, they got psychedelic nightmare sequences, cruel punishments, and a version of Willy Wonka that felt more like a trickster than a mentor. The infamous boat ride scene remains one of the most disturbing sequences in family film history. As the boat drifted through a dark tunnel, Gene Wilder delivered a monologue about chaos and fear, while flashes of bizarre imagery lit up the screen. Kids squirmed. Parents stared, wondering why this was considered safe. But the unease didn't stop there. One by one, the children were subjected to bizarre fates. Augustus sucked into a pipe, Violet swelling up like a blueberry, Veruca dropped into a chute. These moments weren't cartoonish slapstick. They were strange, sinister, and often unsettling. The PG rating did nothing to warn families. Instead of a sugary musical, they got a cautionary tale filled with surreal visuals and a performance by Wilder that was both brilliant and unnerving. Willy Wonka has since become a cult favorite, but its misrating remains clear. This wasn't harmless fantasy. It was weird, dark, and unforgettable. Dragonslayer, 1981. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was a grim, fire-filled descent into dark fantasy. When Disney and Paramount teamed up for Dragonslayer, the PG rating led parents to believe they were in for another magical adventure. What they got was one of the most violent fantasy films of its era. The dragon Vermithrax wasn't a playful creature, it was a terrifying force. Victims were burned alive, charred remains littered the screen, and villages were torn apart. Even more disturbing were the scenes of young women chosen as sacrifices, their fear painted across the screen as the beast awaited them. The tone was relentlessly bleak. Instead of swashbuckling heroes and whimsical magic, the film delivered death, destruction, and despair. Critics praised its groundbreaking special effects and gritty realism, but families who walked in expecting Disney-level charm left shaken. The MPAA's PG rating made no sense. This was far too graphic for children, yet not quite bloody enough for an R. Once again, the system left families blindsided. Dragonslayer has since been embraced as a hidden gem of the fantasy genre, but at the time, it was a harsh reminder that PG didn't mean safe. If anything, it meant prepare yourself for the unexpected. Return to Oz, 1985. This wasn't a whimsical follow-up to The Wizard of Oz, it was a horror show disguised as family entertainment. Return to Oz arrived with a PG rating, and parents expecting songs and rainbows found themselves in theaters watching children cover their eyes. The movie opens with young Dorothy being taken to a mental institution for electroshock therapy, a far cry from skipping down the yellow brick road. From there, she's plunged into a nightmare version of Oz, one filled with twisted villains and unsettling imagery. The Wheelers, with their screeching laughter and wheels for limbs, terrified children worldwide. And Princess Mombi, who kept a haul of severed heads she swapped at will, was pure nightmare fuel. Disney leaned hard into gothic darkness, creating a film that scarred an entire generation. The PG rating offered no hint of how terrifying it truly was. Parents complained, critics were divided, and children remembered it for decades as one of the scariest films they ever saw. Return to Oz has since earned cult status, admired for its boldness, but its misrating is legendary. This wasn't the land of Oz families knew. It was a land of psychological horror, and the MPAA stamped it PG without a second thought.
The Secret of NIMH, 1982. This wasn't just an animated adventure. It was one of the darkest kids' movies ever passed off with a PG rating. Parents rented it expecting a gentle cartoon about talking animals. Instead, they got a moody, terrifying tale filled with death, danger, and imagery that felt far more suited to a thriller than family entertainment. Based on Robert C. O'Brien's novel, the film follows Mrs. Brisby, a field mouse, as she seeks the help of genetically enhanced rats to save her sick child. But the journey is anything but cute. The visuals are steeped in gothic shadows, eerie music, and grotesque character designs. The great owl sequence alone was nightmare fuel, as a monstrous owl loomed in the darkness, eyes glowing as it threatened to devour her. For many kids, that scene alone was enough to spark weeks of nightmares. But the real shock came in the film's intensity. Rats fought brutally with swords and claws. Death was a constant presence, hovering over every scene. And the underlying themes of cruelty, survival, and sacrifice pushed the film into territory far heavier than PG suggested. Critics praised the artistry, noting Don Bluth's dedication to treating animation seriously. But families weren't prepared for just how grim it felt. Parents expecting lighthearted fun instead found themselves consoling shaken children who had just endured one of the most unsettling family films ever made. The Secret of NIMH has since been embraced as a classic, admired for its boldness and beauty. But its rating remains baffling. PG suggested safe entertainment. What audiences got instead was gothic despair, harrowing imagery, and a movie that proved once again the MPAA often had no idea what kids could actually handle.
Young Sherlock Holmes, 1985. This wasn't just a detective adventure. It was one of the darkest PG-rated films of the 80s. Young Sherlock Holmes followed teenage versions of Holmes and Watson, but its imagery was anything but juvenile. The most infamous moments came during the hallucination sequences. Under the influence of a sinister curse, characters saw grotesque visions, corpses rising, food turning into monsters, and daggers flying straight at them. These weren't silly illusions, they were intense, disturbing, and unforgettable. Layer on top of that a plot involving ritual sacrifice, sinister conspiracies, and life-threatening battles, and you had a film that felt more like a horror thriller than a light-hearted adventure. Parents walked in expecting clever detective fun, and instead got imagery that haunted children for years. The PG rating? Another misstep. It did nothing to prepare audiences for the darkness waiting inside. While critics admired its ambition, families were left stunned by what had been sold as safe. Today, young Sherlock Holmes is remembered as a cult favorite, but it also lives on in scariest childhood moments lists everywhere. And all because the MPAA once again stamped PG on something that was anything but. So there you have it. 15 times the MPAA completely missed the mark, handing out PG ratings to films that were anything but safe for kids. From sharks and ghosts to dragons and gremlins, these movies prove that those little letters on the poster weren't always reliable. Which of these misratings shocked you the most? Drop your pick in the comments, hit subscribe for more deep dives, and remember, just because it says PG doesn't mean it's safe for popcorn and pajamas. Sometimes it means prepare for nightmares.